thanks very much for inviting me and for asking me to keynote on identity. And I don't think I have much new things to say today, but I hope I can sort of kind of inject some things I grapple with into your discussions today. Some things where I think we need to think about, as you say, we as scholars of material culture, and there are a couple of things we need to consider and pay attention to if we think about identity. And I started today with a very simple thing, as people do, just a definition of what identity is. And here take it from the Oxford English Dictionary. And there's just a snippet from it. It's a much longer definition, but in the snippet it says, who or what a person or thing is, a distinct impression of a single person or thing presented to or perceived by others, a set of characteristics or a description that distinguishes a person or thing from others, just as a couple of parameters within which we might sort of kind of think the concept of identity. And I wanted to start here to sort of, well, give me sort of kind of a basis to then think about what does it mean. Oh, now I have to, sorry, move myself around to not block the caption. What does it mean to think about identity when we look at objects such as this? And this is going to be my case study for today. A Greek Athenian red figure Hydria from around the 420s BCE. It's not a, I have worked on this thing, so some of you might have read some of the things I've already said about it. It's a nice Hydria which is in Karlsruhe in the museum, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. But when we look at an object like this, what does it mean to think about a distinct impression of a thing? And that's the sort of thing I want to kind of tease out today in my keynote. The object we see, how can we turn it into something that helps us understand, in this particular case, Athenian 5th century identity better. Now, when we think about artworks and we think about what we do with artworks and how we sort of conceptualize our doing artworks, there are obviously sort of kind of lots of tools out there, lots of methods which have been developed by various people to help us analyze objects such as this, not necessarily with a view to identity, but with a view to all sorts of other sort of things you might want to find out about the underlying sort of kind of cultural currents that shape these objects. And one of the things one of the methods which I think is certainly for me one of the most influential methods when I think about my own sort of kind of practice of thinking about things such as are depicted on the Hydria I just shown you, mythological depictions from, in this particular case, 5th century Athens. One of the key theories or method, well, it's not a theory, it's a method. One of the key methods is Erwin Panofsky's iconological analysis and interpretation. And it's a famous sort of approach, has been criticized a lot as an approach as well, has been sort of kind of modified as an approach as well. But what I just want to go back to is sort of the early beginnings of Panofsky trying to sort of kind of pin down his approach. And I'm taking you here to this an excerpt, sort of the beginning from his famous article about the problem of describing and interpreting works of the visual arts, which was sort of the starting point for his thinking about or developing his method of iconology. And there he writes something about Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, who wrote, some of you will know this treatise, 18th century treatise on why texts are better than images. And Panofsky says about this as in the 11th of his antiquarian letters, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing discusses a phrase from Lucian's description of the painting by Zeuxis called A Family of Centaurs. And he says at the top of the painting, a centaur is leaning down as if from an observation point, smiling. And this, as if from an observation point, Lessing notes obviously implies that Lucian himself is uncertain whether this figure was positioned further back or was at the same time on higher ground. So Panofsky sort of zooms in on an episode Lessing uses, and Lessing uses to make a point about that, it's impossible. Pictures are impossible because they're not clear, and only text can sort of tell a clear story. And he uses this episode to say that Lucian, who was quite a smart guy, wasn't actually able to come up with a appropriate description of this particular painting. So this is Lessing's argument that pictures are not clear. And Panofsky turns this around and says, well, no, the problem here is not that pictures are not clear, but the thing is that in order to be able to understand a picture in the way it wants to be understood, you could say, we as interpreters actually need to have an idea about the sort of the stylistic, the appearance of the picture. So in this particular case, there's something going on with perspective. And if one does not understand the sort of the concept of perspective at this particular moment of in time, it is impossible to describe the picture appropriately and to make sense of the picture appropriately. And that sort of leads Panofsky then to the fact, or to kind of argue for interpreters to become very good at understanding individual periods of time and the sort of the traits and the stylistic sort of kind of appearance of particular moments in time in order to be able to do the first step of their analysis, the description and getting into an artwork and understanding an artwork. And Panofsky in this same piece takes this further with another example, which is sort of at the other end of the spectrum, you could say. So in the case of Lucian trying to make sense of Zeuxis, the problem is that Lucian lived a few centuries after Zeuxis and wasn't aware anymore of the sort of the conditions in which artworks communicated. And Panofsky in the same piece uses another painting in this particular case here, and I show you Franz Marc's mandrel. You can see the mandrel in here somewhere, and he uses this to make the point that we can have a similar problem, but we can have a similar problem at the point when an artist, in this case, creates something so new that the viewers are not used to making sense of it, so they don't even find the ape in the picture because they're not able to sort of kind of dissect these big blocks of color and this sort of kind of approach to, well, this expressionistic approach to conveying a particular piece of content. And here's the relevant excerpt from Panofsky's writing, and just see to kind of highlight this, that in 1919, quoting here what Panofsky writes, the people of Hamburg were unable to identify the object painted by Franz Marc because they were not yet familiar with the representational principles of expressionism. And Lucian wasn't able to grasp the consecutive arrangement of the figures painted by Zeuxis because the representational principles of early Greek art had already vanished. So this is the conundrum here. And Panofsky ends with the last sentence here on my slide. Even if this sounds paradoxical, it is thus the case that a work of art unknown to the describer with regard to period or style has to be classified by him within the history of style even before it can be described. So just the point I tried to make. And this is the main premise of iconological analysis as a means of trying to understand in a picture. And I think for us, this is a main challenge now when we try to make sense of something like identity, because it's sort of essentially, if you take Panofsky's word seriously, and I think there's, from my own experience, I would think there are some valuable elements here which are quite true, that we have to have sort of the egg-chicken issue sort of kind of confronts us all the time when we try to make sense of artworks. But if you take this seriously, then it raises all sorts of questions how we can manage to actually sort of kind of pinpoint something like, or grasp something like identity, given that we first of all have to understand the sort of the collective traits of a particular artwork before we can then try to drill down into the sort of the specific and the what in the OED is called the distinct impressions of this particular artwork. So I think there seems to be a paradox already here at this point of considering what our practice might be as interpreters of ancient visual art, and the sort of the demands of what we search for, or information about identity. And I think that's sort of kind of an interesting challenge. And I want to sort of unpack this a little in the following few minutes, thinking about my sort of case study here, the Hydria from Karlsruhe. And I think we have a couple of sort of, a few options we could sort of kind of dip into in order to figure out what the distinct impressions of a piece of an artwork like this could be. So one element, and I think Jerome has sort of outlined this, one thing we could think about is something like context. So, where was this used? Is this sort of kind of, in what function did it fulfill? Do we know anything about it? Sort of kind of, where was it deposited, and so on. And in this particular case, as with many other Greek vases, for instance, we have no idea about that sort of thing. This comes from the art market. We don't have any specific idea about the actual archaeological context with which it was used. So we would not be able to use that in this particular case to sort of kind of grasp the distinct impression of this object in its particular sort of kind of contextual use. The other option I think we have is we can look at the content. In this particular case, it's a depiction of the Judgment of Paris, so a very sort of kind of popular story, both in Greek and Roman antiquity. We have Paris here sitting in the center of the picture. He's accompanied by a little Cupid or Eros, and he's accompanied by Hermes, who seems to be in some sort of kind of negotiation situation with him. And we also have the three goddesses here. So we have Aphrodite here, also accompanied by little Eros. We have Athena, who's very easily recognizable by her helmet and aegis and weaponry. And here on the left-hand side, we have Hera. So we could think about the story, and we could think about the popularity of the story at different points in the 5th century in this particular case, the popularity in this particular case of this particular story in the 430s and 420s. There seems to be a little bit of a peak of the story. And then we can sort of, cross-compare these different, the ways, these different, the different ways the story could be visualized, could be shown. And that might help us to tease out some distinct impressions of this particular depiction, and with that, ideally also something along the lines of identity regarding particular viewers or regarding particular sort of aspects that are highlighted in the story. And then I think we have another option, a third option, and that's the option I want to think about a bit more closely. And I want to think about it a bit more closely today, because I think in some ways it's the trickiest of all the options. And it's the trickiest of all the options because it is particularly this aspect which Panofsky tried to bring out as the sort of the background information we have to have before we can even start to make sense of any individual picture. And that is the artistic style. That is the sort of the language in which the image stands in front of us. And I want to focus on this not only because it seems to be the trickiest of all the options today, but also because I think it is one of the sort of the most constitutional of the options with regard to the fact that we are here dealing with visual monuments, and they have a particular sort of kind of language, a particular style in which they confront us. And so I think we have to engage with that because otherwise we fall short of some of the demands that the objects and the monuments confront us with regard to how they want to be viewed and read. So when we think about artistic style, there are lots of things we can then think about. Now, in the old days, in sort of traditional classical archaeological scholarship, people would have started to talk about things like folds, for instance, of the garments, and we can have a close look at those things here. They're very interesting here with this particular object, but on a more sort of primary level, I think we can already sort of, with regard to the composition of the picture, there are elements of the artistic style which are interesting. And in this particular situation, I think what is quite interesting is the fact, and this is why I show you the outline drawing, because it's more visible here than on the photographs of the actual vase. You can see there are rocky sort of lines drawn in here. There's a landscape situation with rocks, and some of the figures are sort of acting behind sort of different sort of kind of levels of landscape, so to speak, or sit here on individual rocks. You can see these thin white lines. And we also have some shrubbery here embedded in the picture, little sort of kind of laurel bushes that are sort of jotted into the picture. So we can sort of kind of take note of these and sort of identify these as important constituents of the compositional sort of layout of the picture. Then we can obviously, what I just said, look at the rendering of the figures. This is kind of interesting here. So we can do this with the male naked bodies, obviously, and you all know about this sort of the stylistic development of the human form in 5th century Athens, and there are elements here in the pictorial sort of rendering of male nudity that that we can sort of kind of highlight and sort of also put in a chronological sequence. And we can look at the figure, at the rendering of the drapery of the figures, of the female figures. And here in particular, we have sort of kind of two slightly different elements. We have figures here with very, very thin ketons here, like this dancer, the Maenad in the center of the lower frieze, which shows sort of kind of a lot of the body underneath, and rather is sort of kind of almost works as if to highlight the body more than it sort of covers it. And Robin Osborne might be talking a little bit more about sort of garments and drapery in the afternoon today. And we have these other figures here, the Peploi figure, where you can sort of see some of the heavier folds and a very distinct way of these folds falling over the legs in this particular case. So we can have a look at these particular elements, and they would help us to, again, sort of kind of pinpoint a particular chronological position for this piece. And in fact, this is how, you know, we get to a date such as 420 in this particular case. But then there are other things which are sort of probably pushing the definition of artistic style, but I want to sort of make a case for them being also part of an artistic style, and more specifically, perhaps being part of something along the lines of an artistic brand in this particular case. And they go beyond the mere layout questions of the compositional sort of kind of setup, and they go beyond the mere sort of kind of aspect of the actual rendering, the individual rendering of the figures. And this is the particular choice of figures employed here. So I've already sort of introduced some of the divine figures here involved in the judgment of Parisine, the reason why we can identify it as the judgment of Parisine. But one of the interesting things about this particular picture is that there are other figures as well. So not just divine figures. And the great thing is, because we have name labels with the figures, most of the figures, at least in the upper picture field, we can identify them. And there's one particular interesting feature here, because we get figures who act as personifications. So figures who are, to a certain extent, also divine figures, but they have a meaning beyond that, or in addition to that. And this seems to be is quite sort of kind of obvious about this particular picture, because here, well, in this line drawing at the top, but I'll show you another picture of the complete vessel later on. You can see it's still at the top, but in a slightly different. It feels slightly different. Is the figure of Ares, of strife, who sits sort of kind of over the tableau of the judgment that unfolds underneath her. And I would sort of kind of identify this use of personifications as something which is part of this artistic style in this case, because it is a constitutional element of the way the picture comes together and is brought together. And I'll make another case for that in a moment. Now, what is now interesting about, and here you can see how the figure of Ares sort of kind of works with the body of the vessel, so to speak, when we look at the complete object. And I think here, from this perspective at least, it is particularly obvious that this figure is sort of kind of highlighted, and there's a kind of a clearly kind of a spotlight on this figure of Ares. And what is interesting about the figure of Ares in her role as personification is that in her dress, so in the artistic rendering of her appearance, she is aligned with other personifications on this vessel. So that we have some more personifications who are also sort of kind of appear as this type of female figure. But especially in the way her hair is rendered, she's got very wild hair. She's sort of aligned with some of the clearly more divinely connotated figures, and specifically also the figures here in the lower frieze, the wild dancing Maenads. So not only does she seem to have a kind of a dual purpose, so to speak, in her role as a personification and a divinity, but she also seems to, this sort of dual role seems to be brought out by the way she is rendered. And with that, with an eye on that, I would argue that another sort of specific feature of, or kind of constituting feature of the artistic style on this particular vessel is an interest in bringing out, highlighting ambiguities in a particular scene and with regard to particular figures. And then we have a few things that might or might not actually be part of the artistic style, and I would want to make a case that they are, but it's sort of, it is much more ephemeral, and it is much easier to not think about these features in that way. And in fact, a lot of scholarship has been written about pots such as this without ever thinking about these features as something defining the artistic style of this particular, you know, of a pot such as this. And this is coming back to my shrubs, the laurel bushes, because when you look at the narrative, what is really interesting, the way sort of the story is presented here, the story of the judgment of Paris. And when we compare it to other representations, the iconography of the story over time in Greek visual art, this is a very complex way of communicating the story, because the group of constituent sort of kind of figures that make the myth, Paris, Hermes, and the three goddesses, is sort of blown up in a certain way, and blown up in a way which puts a lot of demands on the viewers to figure out what is really going on. As I told you, we have Paris in the center. He's oriented towards Hermes. Hermes is sort of oriented towards him, but perhaps also to the shepherd dog sitting in front of Paris. There's the Eros, who seems to be having a sort of kind of a little silent negotiation with Paris. So there's the question of, is Paris really oriented towards Hermes, or has he just eyes for the Eros? And then we have two of the goddesses, Hera and Athena, obviously the ones who won't win the contest, on one side, close to Paris. And then we have Aphrodite, who is going to be ultimately the winner of this contest, on the other side, and quite far away from Paris in some ways. But she also has an Eros, so there's a connecting figure, like a bracketing device. You could say the dual appearance of the Eros figure acts as if a bracketing device to put these two together, and Paris looks at her. So it's a very complex way of lots of different levels in which we can sort of bring these figures into interaction. And my feeling is that the shrubs, they might be sort of kind of, it might be by chance that they are where they are, but they happen to be in positions where they actually help to highlight the role of Paris here. So there's this laurel bush here, there's this laurel bush here, and there's this laurel bush here that highlights Aphrodite again. So there might be a narrative sort of kind of dimension to the way these shrubs work as partitioning devices. And the way that is implemented here might be also, I would see it, I would understand it also as part of the artistic style that constitutes, that shapes, that makes the picture. Now we have another sort of aspect that is, I think, quite constitutional to this particular picture, and I've already talked about the sort of the explosiveness in various ways of the arrangement of the figures and the many different ways in which we can connect individual figures. And I haven't even started to talk about all these other figures that are also in the picture field, including Ares, who also might sort of kind of fuel this sort of multi-layered approach to storytelling. But the way this is done here, the way in which we don't have we have a clear center in Paris, but a clear center that doesn't give us a sort of a clear outcome to the narrative, on display. And that is something very different to earlier versions of telling this particular story, and certainly earlier versions of telling other stories on Greek pots. The way this is done here seems to me deliberate, and deliberate with the result that as a viewer, one has to put in a lot of energy in order to kind of actually figure out what is going on. But also as a viewer, one has the benefit of figuring out one's own sort of kind of trajectory through the story, one's own individual storyline, which in this particular case will always be a storyline roughly dealing with themes of desire and choice in one way or another, and the results and the sort of repercussions of that. But within those parameters, there are lots of options here in the way the figures are arranged, and also in the way, and I haven't talked about that, and I won't talk about that today, in the way then there's a second picture field, the frieze that runs around the vessel, that might also have sort of elements of interaction with what is going on above it. Now, lastly, in terms of the what I called here blurry lines, in this particular case, it is very much a line situation. Lastly, there are elements on this pot that might also play a role in constituting the artistic style beyond their mere sort of kind of function as, again, partitioning devices. And I'm here thinking about these checkerboard, meander sort of kind of bands that run around these two picture fields. And what is very interesting here, and this is why I brought along, and so I had to kind of move myself here, perhaps in the middle now. I brought along another vessel from the period, another one of my favorite vessels from the period. Quite a few of you, I'm sure, will have seen this before. Another Hydria from was signed by who we call the Midas painter. We find a very, very similar setup. Also, these checkerboard meander bands that separate a frieze from an upper picture field that's kind of a panoramic picture field, and that seems to be something here which is used to not only to work as a mere partition, but to sort of, you could say, almost sort of serve as some sort of compression device, because it creates a clear separation, albeit a clear separation that through the checkerboards and the meander sort of kind of has a potential to be quite blurry and to open up in a particular way, again, and be unraveled by viewers, yet again only unraveled in a way which is then different from the third sort of kind of partitioning device used here, the Lotus Parnat frieze on the upper picture field. And you've got this here too with a horizontally oriented lotus flower, and here we've got a vertically oriented lotus flower that, while acting as a partitioning device, still seems to have more openness, or sort of an openness of a different kind compared to these two bands, and hence might stand in some sort of relationship also to the narrative depicted in the upper picture field. So here again, I think I would regard these partitioning elements as an element of the artistic style of this particular object, of this particular pot. Now, lastly, in terms of the artistic style, there's a sort of an area which sort of kind of, like the story of the Judgment of Paris, sort of is borderline sort of impact, or sort of kind of reaching into the sphere of one of my other options, the options of content. But I think in this particular case, I want to sort of kind of revisit it and view it from the point of view of artistic style, from the perspective of artistic style again. And this is that we find sort of pointers in this particular picture that let us think about Athens, and let us think about Athens in particular ways. And this is beyond the fact that obviously we as scholars know this is a red figure, Athenian vase. Ancient consumers of this pot, or ancient users of this pot, will have also known this. This is kind of communicated already through, well, the shape, but also through the type of clay, and certainly through the type of decoration. But it is also sort of communicated through certain elements that are part of the narrative, are part of the content of the scene. And in this particular case, it's Athena is in the picture. And one could make the argument that the iconography of this particular Athena here in the picture with a shield that is decorated inside as well recalls the Athena Parthenos in many ways. So a very particular statue of Athena linked with the city of Athens, and specifically linked with the Athenian Acropolis. And once one has made that connection, then the rocky landscape and the laurel shrubs could also be seen as reference to the same location, the Athenian Acropolis, very specifically, despite the fact that they are not specific as shrubs and rocks. And one could then also sort of push it a little bit further, and considering, I haven't talked about this at all, considering the dress of Paris, which is very flamboyant. He's got checkered trousers and he's got a highly decorated sort of kind of tunic. It's a dress of the theater. It's a dramatic dress, and one could sort of then sort of take it a bit further. We already started thinking about the Acropolis in Athens. We could start thinking about the theater of Dionysus and figures in the theater of Dionysus, the institution of the Athenian theater. And that could be helped, might be helped by the fact that Dionysus himself is here in the Lower Frieze, not very far away from Paris, this theatrical character in the upper picture field. So in this sort of highlighting of Athenian features, we could also see a particular sort of element of the artistic style, and a particular element of the artistic style which presupposes a very specific type of audience. Now, I've taken you through various bits and pieces of this pot in order to make one particular point, and one particular point about the artistic style and the individual elements which constitute the artistic style of this Karlsruhe pot. When we take this further now, it is quite easy to make, and I'm obviously not the first person to make this claim, you know, people have done this before, but it is quite easy to make the point that all these features, they constitute the artistic style of this particular pot, but they also constitute the artistic style of a particular group of vase painters who have decorated pots, or who decorated pots in the 420s in Athens. And a lot of the features reoccur on these other pots and constitute something along the lines of artistic branding. And obviously that's something as scholars we would sort of reversely, in an act of reverse engineering, use to group these, you know, like Beasley did, group these pots together, these vessels together under the name of the same artist, or under the name of a group of artists. And in fact, this is what has been done here. I'm showing you vessels by the mightiest painter and what we call his circle. So the Karlsruhe piece is sort of not seen as a sort of a work by the artist himself, but of a wider circle of people who share particular elements of artistic style. And we can see here, so I brought you another example here, a Lekythos in Cleveland. We can see some of these features, some of these elements of artistic style across other pots. And here in this particular case, again, I would like to highlight the use of shrubbery and rocky landscapes. We also have an Athena here who isn't armed, but in all the other elements does look or has elements of the Athena Parthenos. And we have something here which is sort of perhaps a difference in quality. We have a story depicted that is a very Athenian story in this particular case, the birth of Erichthonios. So a key sort of myth in the founding, in the sort of the claims of the autochthony of the Athenian land. So this seems to be defining, if nothing else, an artistic identity, even if, you know, as I just said, it's a bit unclear exactly how narrow or how wide this artistic identity could be taken. And it's also defining a specific Athenian identity in many ways, because we know there are certain claims made here in vessels such as these two about what constitutes Athens and how Athens should be seen. Oh yeah, and I've got a close up here again where you can see some of the elements we talked about again quite nicely: the shrubs, the rocks, the garments and the folds, and here also in this particular case the baby and the specific sort of interpretation of specific focus on the story. And what perhaps is quite interesting with this piece too, now we don't have any name labels here, but in this piece we have something we've already seen on the Karlsruhe pot also with regard to the ambiguities around identification. We have ambiguities around the roles of the figures here. So this is potentially the mother of Erichthonios, or like Ge, who hands over the baby to Athena according to the myth, but she shares lots of features with a normal Athenian woman. So we have here the blurry lines of the identification of these characters. Are they mythological? Are they just women? And there are quite a few other women in the picture. We couldn't identify in any particular way, so we have to assume that they are just Athenian women. So we have a bit of an ambiguity going on here. Now, I've taken you through a lot of elements that constitute artistic style. I tried to kind of make a comparison with another pot, or with two pots, in fact, to show the sort of well, an element of the artistic context. Really, this is what I've tried, with regard to the fact that we lack an archaeological context. We can construct something along the lines of an artistic context here, referencing other pots that share similar features. But the problem now is, I think, and this is one of the things, but one of the questions I don't have an answer to, but one of the questions I think we need to think about on a day like today, and in the context of grappling with the concept of identity. What I've tried to do was to construct the artistic elements and the artistic sort of stylistic elements that constitute the Karlsruhe pot in an attempt to do what Panofsky wants us to do in order to be able to then start interpreting. And what I see as a problem here when it comes to identity is I can only do this if I try to figure out what the collective traits are, what the sort of the things are that collectively are shared by elements in the pot, because I need to create references to other pieces. I need to kind of contextualize individual elements like the folds in a wider narrative of artistic styles. And I need to do the same thing with iconographic elements and so on and so forth. So I end up with something which is an artistic brand, and an artistic brand where it is quite difficult to say what the identity of that is beyond, well, the more individual identity of that is. And this is why I sort of kind of use the term Identi-Kit in my discussion, because I think essentially what I've done with the Karlsruhe Hydria is to carve out the Identi-Kit appearance of a particular type of vessels in a particular period in Athens. And that, I think, to my mind then raises the question, if I do that, can I still talk about identity, or have I actually taken the discussion completely away from what you try to achieve today with your day, and that is to hone in on the specifics, on the sort of the distinct impressions of a particular thing. Now, I think to end on a happy note, I think that is still possible, but I think it's a sort of ambiguity we have to somehow sort of square if we want to talk about identity. And I think the way in which it is still possible, and that would be sort of my answer to this and my sort of kind of approach towards trying to tease out identity, is while I need to do what I've just done, dismantling an object such as this into its own individual artistic stylistic elements and trying to sort of contextualize them and putting them in the bigger picture. Once I've done that, I can still then again start to see or to look into how these artistic stylistic elements, these elements kind of creating the brand of the artist in the case of the individual object, such as the Karlsruhe Hydria, are brought together to then again generate something which is very, very distinct, a distinct impression that differentiates this particular pot from all the other pots which might share the same sort of artistic branding. And I think, and this is why sort of taking you through all these different sort of kind of aspects, I think this is only possible if we sort of kind of unpack and unfold all these different aspects, because in the sort of juggling together, then again, the interrelationship between the layout, the choice of content, the choice of sort of figure rendering, the choice of figures, we are able to sort of kind of generate our own tableau that is big enough, sort of dense enough, you could say, thick enough, to really then sort of kind of pinpoint the differences between this particular vessel sharing a particular artistic sort of kind of branding, and this particular vessel sharing sharing the same artistic branding, but making individual points that are quite different. And so I think this is what I would regard as the key challenge in taking on identity as a topic. But I think, and I hope, a challenge still worthwhile. And I think a challenge not so different from some of the other challenges we encounter when we try to make sense of visual art such as this in general. So thank you very much.